It was an unusually warm spring afternoon, the kind of day where the sun hangs lazily over the neighborhood and the faint scent of freshly mown grass drifts through the air, teasing every sense awake. I had just parked my truck in the driveway after a long morning of errands, feeling the satisfaction of small victories as I shut off the engine and let the quiet hum of the suburban street wash over me. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until I noticed the glossy, overly crisp envelope sitting on my doorstep, its heavy paper practically screaming authority. I picked it up, feeling the weight of officiousness in my hands, and immediately recognized the HOA insignia stamped boldly in gold at the top. My heart sank, not because I had forgotten any rules, God knows I followed them meticulously, but because the HOA, with all its rigid bureaucracy and endless mandates, had an uncanny ability to manufacture conflict out of the most mundane aspects of daily life. I tore the envelope open with a mix of curiosity and dread, and the contents made me laugh bitterly. They were notifying me that my upcoming barbecue, a simple gathering of friends in my backyard, was under scrutiny and that certain guests I had invited were prohibited under newly amended HOA guidelines. Reading between the lines, it was clear that someone in their ranks had taken it upon themselves to enforce rules that didn't exist a week ago, all while maintaining a smug sense of self-importance. I set the letter down on my porch table, my mind racing, and tried to imagine the absurdity of calling out my friends, people I had known for years, for merely stepping foot in my yard. But as I brewed a strong cup of coffee and scanned the neighborhood, I realized that this wasn't just about etiquette or landscaping, this was about power, the subtle, choking kind that a handful of people could wield over others when armed with a clipboard, a pen, and a distorted interpretation of regulations. I thought about the meticulous fencing, the manicured hedges, the very concrete foundations of our homes that were supposedly designed to protect value, yet here I was, feeling trapped in a world where my own backyard was no longer mine to share freely. Little did I know that the absurdity of the situation would soon escalate to levels that no HOA meeting, no matter how overbearing or pretentious, could ever prepare me for. Within a few hours, my quiet suburban street would become the stage for a confrontation that blurred the lines between local bureaucracy, personal freedom, and political clout, and I would find myself at the center of it all, armed only with my wits, a few carefully drafted invitations, and an unshakable resolve to defend what was mine, not just in law, but in principle. The day of the barbecue arrived with a deceptively cheerful sky, a brilliant blue that seemed almost conspiratorial in its perfection, mocking the tension that had been simmering in my chest for the past 48 hours. I had spent the morning meticulously preparing the yard, rearranging tables, ensuring that the grill was spotless and ready, and setting out decorations that were simple but welcoming, nothing ostentatious, nothing in violation of any of the HOA guidelines I had ever read. I moved deliberately, each step measured, as if performing a ritual meant to shield myself from the absurd bureaucracy that had invaded my life. The scent of charcoal and marinated meats mingled with the faint aroma of blooming roses along the fence line, creating a harmony of homey domesticity that contrasted sharply with the storm I anticipated. As the clock inched toward the time my guests were scheduled to arrive, I began to pace, my hands running nervously along the edges of the patio chairs, feeling the weight of anticipation press down on me like a tangible force. I checked my watch repeatedly, even though I knew my friends were punctual. The anxiety was not about their arrival but about the scrutiny I expected from the HOA, which had now crossed a line from petty interference into something more invasive, a shadow that stretched over every inch of my property. Then, the moment came, the sound of engines, laughter, and footsteps that signaled the arrival of my friends. I stepped back toward the house, heart hammering, and saw them pulling up in their vehicles, sleek sedans, a motorcycle or two, all of them emblematic of personalities I had cherished and respected for years. But there was an added element that I had not anticipated, one that would transform this mundane social gathering into an event for the history books. Among my guests were two individuals I recognized almost immediately, although in the casual setting of a friendly barbecue I had no reason to expect their presence. They were state legislators, prominent figures whose reputations extended far beyond our small suburban enclave, people whose names had been in the newspapers, whose speeches I had heard broadcast across countless channels, and whose policies I had debated in private conversations over coffee or dinner with friends. Seeing them step out of the vehicles, casually greeting neighbors with a polite nod, I felt a surge of both pride and apprehension. Pride because they had accepted my invitation, indicating a personal trust and regard that was rare, and apprehension because the HOA had absolutely no inkling of who they were, nor any authority to challenge their presence. Yet I could already imagine the outrage that would erupt when the letter-waving, clipboard-wielding enforcers of the community's supposed decorum realized that they were facing more than just casual guests. They were confronting figures of political power, people whose influence extended far beyond the confines of our manicured lawns and wooden fences. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain a veneer of calm, and greeted each guest with practiced cordiality, all the while my mind spinning through 1,000 possible scenarios of confrontation. My friends chatted, laughed, and unpacked coolers and folding chairs, oblivious to the silent tension that had taken root in my chest. They were the eye of the storm, blissfully unaware that an HOA notice had set the stage for a showdown that could redefine my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. I walked over to the legislators, extending my hand in greeting, and was met with firm, warm shakes and smiles that carried both familiarity and the gravity of their positions. The conversation was light at first, talk of schedules, recent legislative battles, and the mundane anecdotes that bridge professional personas and private lives, but beneath the surface, a mutual awareness simmered. We all knew that the appearance of state officials in a private suburban gathering was no triviality, particularly under the scrutiny of a local homeowners association whose capacity for petty tyranny was already legendary in our neighborhood. As the aroma of grilled burgers and roasted vegetables filled the air, I moved among the guests, checking trays of condiments, refilling drinks, and making sure everyone was comfortable, all the while keeping a watchful eye toward the driveway and the edges of the street where the HOA enforcers might attempt to appear, clipboard in hand, eyes gleaming with the misguided satisfaction of self-appointed power. And then I saw them, two figures emerging from behind a hedge across the street, their posture rigid, hands gripping the familiar symbols of authority, the clipboard, the letter, the expression of moral rectitude that HOA members often wear as armor. Their eyes locked onto mine, scanning the gathering with a mix of disbelief and thinly veiled anger, as if the very presence of my guests constituted a personal affront. I felt a twinge of amusement beneath the adrenaline, an awareness that the scene unfolding before me was absurd in a way that demanded a careful orchestration of composure. My friends noticed nothing, chatting and laughing, while the legislators, sensing the tension, subtly adjusted their positions, their presence alone acting as a protective barrier against the overreach I knew was coming. I took a deep breath, allowing the warmth of the sun and the convivial chatter of friends to anchor me, but the undercurrent of impending conflict pulsed like a low drumbeat in my chest. I knew that when the HOA confronted me, as they inevitably would, the dynamics would shift, the polite authority of neighborhood rules would collide with the institutional weight of state power, and I would be caught in the delicate balance between neighborly diplomacy and the assertion of my rights. I mentally rehearsed the conversation I might have with them, considering every angle, every possible objection they could raise, and every legal and moral counterpoint I could offer. It was a precarious tightrope, balancing civility with assertiveness, humor with seriousness, all while ensuring that the atmosphere of the barbecue remained intact. Yet even as I planned, my mind wandered to the absurdity of it all, the idea that a private backyard gathering could evolve into a microcosm of political confrontation, a theater where the lines between domestic tranquility and civic authority blurred. The legislators, sensing the subtle unease in the air, leaned in slightly, offering quiet reassurances, nods of understanding that carried more weight than words ever could. I felt the tension ease slightly, their mere presence acting as an invisible shield against the encroaching authority of the HOA, but I also knew that their involvement meant stakes far higher than a mere neighborhood dispute. The dynamics were shifting, evolving from a simple disagreement over rules into a complex interplay of power, influence, and principle, and I realized that the narrative of my quiet life was about to be rewritten in ways that I could not have imagined. As I moved through the yard, serving drinks and engaging in light conversation, I observed my neighbors across the street, their expressions a mix of curiosity, judgment, and thinly veiled envy, unaware of the true weight of the individuals in my backyard. Each glance, each whispered observation seemed to underscore the ridiculousness of the HOA's impending interference. They were attempting to regulate the presence of elected officials in a private gathering, a move that could only be described as comically audacious. The barbecue proceeded, seemingly ordinary, yet the undercurrents were anything but. The aroma of food, the laughter of friends, the gentle clinking of glasses, all these were counterpoints to the tension building just beyond the periphery, a tension that threatened to explode at any moment. And then, as if on cue, the HOA representatives crossed the street, their posture stiff, their faces painted with indignation, and the first words of confrontation were spoken, words that would set the stage for an unforgettable clash between suburban bureaucracy and the unyielding presence of state authority. The heat of the day was now mirrored in the heat of the conflict, and I felt every muscle in my body tense, ready to navigate the surreal collision of worlds that had been triggered by nothing more than a letter, a backyard, and the audacity of human curiosity. The confrontation began almost theatrically, as if the HOA representatives had rehearsed the moment in front of their bathroom mirrors for weeks, clutching their clipboards like shields against the chaos they anticipated. One of them, a woman with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to constrict her very expression, stepped forward first, her voice dripping with self-importance as she began to recite rules and amendments as though they were sacred texts handed down from on high. "You are in violation of HOA Code Section 14, Paragraph 7, she declared, her tone sharp and unwavering, eyes darting toward the legislators with a mixture of fear and audacity, as though their presence somehow diminished her authority yet simultaneously demanded acknowledgement. I felt a flicker of amusement at the absurdity. Here she was, attempting to wield suburban power over elected officials who had the ability to influence legislation affecting thousands, if not millions, of citizens. I stepped forward calmly, hands raised slightly in a gesture of measured diplomacy, while keeping my eyes fixed on her. "I think there may be a misunderstanding," I began, my voice steady, resonating with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are in the right. "These guests are invited to my private property, and their presence is fully within my rights as a homeowner." She blinked, visibly flustered, fumbling with the papers in her hands as if the words themselves had become foreign to her. I could sense the shift in her demeanor, the momentary faltering of someone accustomed to unquestioned authority being confronted with a reality they had never anticipated. My guests, the legislators, remained calm, exuding a quiet power that contrasted sharply with the flustered energy of the HOA enforcers. One of them, a tall man in a crisp suit that glinted in the afternoon sun, stepped slightly forward, his presence alone amplifying the weight of legitimacy in the conversation. "We are here as private citizens, invited by our host," he said, his tone polite yet unyielding, like a gavel striking the desk in a courtroom. "Any attempt to prevent our attendance would be inappropriate and potentially unlawful." The words hit the HOA representatives like ice water, their faces turning from smug certainty to a blend of shock and indignation. I could almost hear the gears in their minds grinding, trying desperately to reconcile the audacity of their imagined authority with the reality of people whose influence extended far beyond the confines of the neighborhood. I felt a surge of vindication, tempered with caution. While I had anticipated some level of conflict, the involvement of state officials elevated the stakes exponentially. The confrontation became a delicate dance of words, a negotiation where civility masked the underlying tension, each party trying to assert dominance without triggering a collapse into chaos. I maintained my composure, aware that any misstep could escalate the situation, while internally marveling at the surreal absurdity of being in the middle of a backyard barbecue that had suddenly become a high-stakes power struggle. My neighbors, drawn by curiosity and the sound of raised voices, began to gather along fences and sidewalks, whispering among themselves, their expressions a mix of awe, confusion, and judgment. Some pointed subtly, as if to signal that they too recognized the gravity of the moment, while others seemed paralyzed by the spectacle, unsure whether to intervene or retreat into the safety of ignorance. I glanced back at my friends, who were still smiling and engaging in casual conversation, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the unfolding drama, their presence grounding me in the surreal reality of the moment. Meanwhile, the HOA representatives attempted to recalibrate, pulling out additional documents, citing obscure clauses that seemed to have been discovered just hours before, as if the rules themselves were malleable depending on their need for control. I listened carefully, nodding occasionally, all while calculating my responses, aware that each word carried weight and could either diffuse or ignite the confrontation. The legislators, sensing the subtle tension and the ineptitude of the HOA enforcers, offered quiet support, their mere presence an invisible shield, allowing me to assert my position without fear of immediate retaliation. "I believe you may be overstepping your jurisdiction," I said, my tone firm but measured, projecting authority not through volume but through clarity and conviction. "These individuals are my guests, invited in a private capacity, and there are no regulations that permit you to restrict their attendance." The word seemed to resonate, carrying through the yard like a ripple in still water. The HOA representatives exchanged nervous glances, their confidence waning as they realized they were facing more than simple homeowners. They were confronting legal and political realities far beyond their comprehension. I watched as the woman's lips pressed into a thin line, the clipboard trembling slightly in her hands, and I knew that the power dynamics had shifted irreversibly. I could see the frustration building, a quiet storm of indignation, as she attempted to regain a sense of control that was slipping through her fingers. The legislators remained poised, offering quiet murmurs of agreement and occasional pointed remarks that reinforced my position without ever raising their voices. It was a masterclass in subtle influence, an orchestration of presence and authority that left the HOA representatives floundering in their attempts to assert dominance. I felt a surge of gratitude toward my guests, aware that their support was both strategic and protective, shielding me from the absurd overreach that had threatened to ruin what should have been a simple gathering. As the minutes stretched on, the conversation evolved into a tense negotiation, each side probing the boundaries of power, testing the limits of patience and protocol. I maintained my stance, speaking with clarity and reason, citing the principles of private property, legal precedent, and community standards, all while carefully avoiding any hint of condescension or aggression. The HOA representatives, sensing their arguments crumbling, began to employ diversionary tactics, shifting focus to trivial infractions and hypothetical scenarios, yet their attempts were ineffective against the weight of reason, authority, and principle. The tension in the yard was palpable, a low hum that threaded through every interaction, yet I remained grounded, buoyed by the presence of friends and legislators alike, the aroma of grilled food providing a subtle reminder of the ordinary joys that had prompted the gathering in the first place. I could see the frustration etched into their faces, the meticulous control they had envisioned slipping like sand through their fingers, replaced by a creeping awareness that their authority was limited, and that their rigid interpretation of rules could not withstand the realities of private rights and civic power. For a moment, I allowed myself a small smile, the kind that comes from recognizing absurdity in the midst of tension, aware that this was a story that would be recounted for years, neighbors whispering about the day the HOA tried to ban guests and ended up confronting state legislators instead. The confrontation continued, each statement, counterpoint, and subtle maneuver building toward a climax that balanced civility and assertiveness, tension and humor, authority and principle. I realized that the situation, while surreal, was also instructive. It revealed the limits of petty power, the importance of reasoned assertion, and the unexpected ways in which ordinary lives intersect with broader spheres of influence. And as I stood there, amidst laughter, the smell of food, the watchful eyes of neighbors, and the quiet yet undeniable presence of political authority, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose. This was no longer merely about a barbecue or a dispute over HOA rules. It was a defining moment, a testament to standing firm, the value of allies, and the sometimes ridiculous, sometimes profound nature of human interactions. And even as the HOA representatives continued their floundering attempts at enforcement, I knew that the victory was already mine, not through confrontation alone, but through the quiet assertion of rights, the presence of allies, and the unwavering confidence that comes from knowing that one stands on solid ground, both literally and metaphorically, in a world that often delights in testing the limits of civility and authority. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of the neighborhood, I felt the momentum of the confrontation subtly shift in my favor, though I knew better than to underestimate the stubbornness of those who believed in the sanctity of petty authority. The HOA representatives, still clutching their clipboards with the desperation of generals facing a war they did not understand, attempted to marshal a semblance of procedural legitimacy, citing bylaws that seemed to have been pulled from a dusty corner of some long-forgotten filing cabinet. I watched them carefully, every twitch of their expressions and every hesitant inflection of their voices registering as I prepared my responses in real time. I understood that this moment was not only about enforcing or rejecting rules but about establishing a narrative, that private property, personal freedom, and reason could triumph over the rigid, often absurd constructs imposed by those who equated control with morality. I moved deliberately through the yard, offering drinks, making small talk, and maintaining a calm exterior, even as the undercurrent of conflict surged with each exchanged sentence. My guests, particularly the legislators, were subtle in their interventions, asking questions that guided the conversation toward clarity, emphasizing legal and civic perspectives without ever needing to raise their voices. Their quiet influence was like an invisible armor surrounding me, and I could sense the unease it generated in the HOA representatives. The woman with the tightly pulled back hair began to stammer, searching for words, as if her mind could not compute the implications of confronting elected officials while simultaneously trying to enforce neighborhood decorum. It was almost comical, the way authority shrinks when it faces the weight of genuine power, but I refrained from any outward display of amusement. I wanted the interaction to remain controlled, strategic, and, above all, decisive. I gently but firmly interjected when necessary, presenting facts and interpretations of the community guidelines with precision, grounding each statement in logic and reason. I appreciate your diligence in maintaining the neighborhood, I said, my tone neutral yet authoritative, but you must recognize that your interpretation of these rules cannot supersede the legal rights of homeowners or the decisions made by private property owners regarding their guests. Their faces flushed, and I could see the mental calculations unfolding, every scenario they had imagined now confronted with the reality that their authority had limits they had never considered. I felt the faint thrill of victory, not born from arrogance but from the recognition that the absurdity of the situation was being dismantled one logical statement at a time. Across the yard, the legislators nodded subtly, their presence reinforcing the credibility of my position, and I realized that what began as a personal challenge had evolved into a microcosm of civic principle, the assertion that reason, legality, and personal freedom should prevail over arbitrary enforcement and imagined hierarchies. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, surveying the gathering, friends laughing, neighbors peering curiously from across the street, and the flustered HOA representatives still attempting to salvage authority. I could almost see their minds working overtime, trying to reconcile the embarrassment of their impotence with the rigid sense of duty that had propelled them here. I decided it was time to assert control more visibly, to take the initiative and shape the outcome on my terms. Moving to the edge of the gathering, I addressed both the enforcers and the neighbors who had gathered, my voice carrying clearly over the murmurs. This is my property, my event, and my choice of guests, I declared, the words ringing with measured conviction. All invited individuals are welcome, and any further attempts to interfere will be documented and addressed appropriately. I watched as their mouths opened and closed, searching for rebuttals, and found none that could withstand the clarity and authority of my statement. The legislators, sensing that the moment required no further intervention on their part, subtly positioned themselves as silent support, their presence alone signaling that any further challenges would have consequences extending beyond the immediate confines of the neighborhood. I felt a surge of control, the kind that comes not from anger but from understanding the rules, knowing your rights, and asserting them with confidence. My friends, now aware of the heightened tension, rallied around me, offering quiet encouragement and smiles that conveyed both pride and relief. The HOA representatives, recognizing that their strategies were collapsing, attempted a final maneuver, citing an obscure amendment and implying potential fines or penalties. I responded calmly, referencing specific legal standards, property rights, and civic principles, each point delivered with precision and clarity, leaving little room for misinterpretation or escalation. Their expressions betrayed frustration and defeat, and I knew that the battle was nearing its conclusion. I could sense the neighborhood spectators absorbing every detail, witnessing an extraordinary unfolding of events in a setting that had once seemed mundane. The tension, once a heavy cloud, began to dissipate as the HOA representatives, unable to maintain their facade of authority, finally relented, muttering half-hearted acknowledgments and retreating toward the edge of the street, clipboards held uselessly in their hands. I felt a mixture of relief and exhilaration, the kind that comes from standing firm, asserting one's rights, and witnessing the absurdity of misguided authority crumble under the weight of logic, principle, and influence. The legislators, now free from the need to intervene, smiled quietly, sharing subtle nods and brief exchanges that conveyed respect and approval, while my friends cheered softly, their laughter mingling with the distant hum of suburban life. The backyard, once the scene of mounting tension, returned to its original state of conviviality, the smells of food, the laughter of friends, and the warmth of the sun reinforcing the normalcy of life reclaimed from the clutches of petty authority. Yet beneath the surface, the day had changed, and I had changed with it. The experience had underscored the importance of asserting one's rights, the value of allies, and the sometimes surreal, sometimes profound nature of conflict and resolution in even the most ordinary of settings. I moved among my guests, offering plates, refilling drinks, and engaging in conversation, all while savoring the quiet triumph that comes not from domination, but from measured, intelligent, and principled action. I knew that the story of this day, the day the HOA attempted to ban guests and confronted state legislators, would linger in the minds of neighbors, whispered in conversations, recounted in laughter, and perhaps even remembered as a lesson in the limits of authority and the enduring power of reason, civility, and courage in defending what is rightfully one's own. As the afternoon slowly melted into evening, the sunlight fading into a warm golden hue that bathed the neighborhood in a calm, almost cinematic glow, I finally allowed myself to exhale, feeling the weight of tension lift from my shoulders in a way that was both liberating and surreal. The HOA representatives had retreated, their clipboards still clutched in hands that now seemed almost comically impotent, while my guests, friends, neighbors who had stood by me, and the state legislators whose mere presence had shifted the dynamics of power, continued to mingle, laugh, and share stories as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet, I knew that this day would not be easily forgotten, for it had crystallized a lesson about authority, personal rights, and the surprising ways that courage, principle, and reason could intersect to reclaim control in the face of petty bureaucracy. I moved through the yard, greeting my friends and making sure everyone had food and drinks, observing the subtle glances exchanged between the legislators and the neighbors, a quiet acknowledgement of the unusual drama that had unfolded. My mind replayed the confrontation over and over, dissecting every interaction, every sentence, every pause, recognizing how delicate yet crucial each moment had been in ensuring that the outcome favored fairness rather than fear. The legislators, though engaging in casual conversation, occasionally offered insights or anecdotes that underscored the importance of standing up against overreach, their words imbued with both wisdom and a quiet authority that carried far more weight than any HOA letter ever could. I felt a deep sense of gratitude toward them, not just for their role in diffusing the situation but for the way their presence illuminated the broader implications of civic responsibility, personal rights, and the courage to assert both in a principled manner. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had become an unwitting audience to a demonstration of these principles, witnessing the limits of localized authority and the enduring power of reason, preparation, and legal grounding. Children ran through the yard, oblivious to the drama that had transpired, their laughter mingling with the gentle rustling of leaves and the fading chirps of birds settling for the evening. I observed the interactions among my neighbors, some whispering to each other, others openly smiling or shaking their heads in disbelief, the collective consciousness of the community subtly shifting as the absurdity and the triumph of the day sank in. My friends clapped me on the back, offered congratulatory remarks, and laughed at the sheer audacity of the HOA's attempts to impose restrictions on a gathering that, in all ways, had been ordinary, friendly, and private. Yet, within me, there was a profound sense of accomplishment that transcended humor or relief. I had navigated a situation that required careful judgment, strategic thinking, calm negotiation, and a steadfast adherence to principle, all while maintaining the dignity of myself and my guests. I thought about the letters, the threats of fines, the procedural citations, and the rigid posturing of the HOA representatives, and I realized how much power they had invested in rules, and how little power those rules held when met with clarity, reason, and the support of both allies and law. As the evening shadows lengthened, I walked to the edge of the yard, surveying the scene from a slight elevation near the back porch. The barbecue was still in full swing, the smell of grilled meats mingling with the faint scent of flowers and freshly cut grass, creating a sensory backdrop to the mental victory I was savoring. My mind wandered to the future, to the countless ways that today's events might ripple outward, shaping the perceptions of neighbors, the strategies of the HOA, and even my own understanding of authority and community. I realized that the victory was not just about defending a gathering or asserting the rights of guests, it was about setting a precedent, about demonstrating the importance of standing firm in the face of overreach, and about balancing civility with strength in a manner that left no room for misinterpretation. The legislators, noticing my reflective pause, approached with quiet smiles, offering subtle congratulations and acknowledging the tact and firmness I had displayed throughout the ordeal. Their recognition was not performative, it carried the gravitas of those accustomed to evaluating people not by surface interactions but by measured judgment and principled action under pressure. I felt both humbled and emboldened, aware that the day had imparted lessons that would remain with me far longer than the memory of the barbecue itself. As darkness settled over the neighborhood and string lights glowed softly over the yard, creating an almost magical ambience, I considered the lingering effects of the confrontation. The HOA representatives had retreated for the evening, likely to regroup and reconsider their approach, and I could only imagine the discussions that would ensue about boundaries, authority, and their own perceptions of power. Yet, I felt no fear, no apprehension, only a quiet confidence in the righteousness of my stance and the clarity of my actions. My friends, sensing the end of the event, began to gather their belongings, exchange contact information, and offer thanks for the hospitality, all the while sharing amused anecdotes about the unusual dynamics of the day. I smiled, engaging with each person, ensuring they felt welcomed, appreciated, and part of a gathering that had unexpectedly become memorable not only for its conviviality but also for the extraordinary circumstances that had unfolded. I thought about the neighbors who had watched from afar, their perspectives subtly influenced, their understanding of authority and civility quietly reshaped by what they had witnessed. The state legislators lingered, offering parting remarks that blended humor, wisdom, and encouragement, acknowledging the delicate balance I had maintained between hospitality and assertiveness. I realized that their presence had done more than protect me in the moment. It had provided a real-world lesson in the application of principle, the use of influence responsibly, and the art of navigating confrontation without surrendering one's integrity. The night air cooled, carrying the soft scent of evening blossoms and distant traffic, and I felt a deep sense of closure, knowing that the events of the day had reached a natural, if extraordinary, conclusion. I reflected on the absurdity, the tension, the strategic maneuvering, and the ultimate triumph, recognizing that this experience had strengthened not only my understanding of personal rights but also my capacity to handle conflict with calm, intelligence, and moral clarity. The backyard, once a simple space for leisure and socializing, had become a stage for a profound assertion of autonomy and principle, a reminder that even in the most ordinary settings, extraordinary events could unfold, and that preparedness, reason, and courage could transform potential crises into moments of triumph. As the last guests departed, the string lights flickering gently in the cooling night, I stood alone for a moment, surveying the yard, the tables, the remnants of laughter and conversation, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Today had been more than a barbecue, it had been a declaration of autonomy, a lesson in civility and courage, and a testament to the power of measured, principled action. I knew that the neighborhood would talk about this day for months, perhaps years, and that the HOA, while still an institution of rules and regulation, had been shown the limits of its reach when faced with clarity, reason, and rightful authority. As I stepped into the house, carrying the quiet glow of victory with me, I understood that this story, my story, was a testament not only to the preservation of a single backyard gathering but also to the enduring principles of fairness, resilience, and the human capacity to navigate absurdity with dignity, intelligence, and unwavering resolve. And in that moment, as the lights of the neighborhood twinkled like distant stars, I felt the rare satisfaction of a day well lived, a battle wisely fought, and a truth clearly affirmed, that while rules can be written, authority can be claimed, and boundaries can be enforced, the power of reason, principle, and courage will always shine brightest when applied with care, clarity, and conviction.